this monument that I'm standing beside is the Salzburger monument that was dedicated to the pastors. The pastors were buried in this general area, and this monument was dedicated March 17th, 1888. It was placed here on the anniversary of the erection of the Stone of Help in 1734. Now, there was a great crowd that gathered in 1888 at the dedication of this monument, and I think the number of attendees is profound. Anybody want to take a guess at how many people came in 1888 to see this monument unveiled? Any guesses?
1,000?
1,000? More.
What?
Oh, wow.
There were actually 2,000 people came from all over. One of the pastors actually traveled, a Neidlinger, traveled from Texas to be able to unveil this monument. So that is, you think of 1888, how'd they get the word out? How'd they get everybody here? You know, there's no social media to say, hey, we're doing this here at our cemetery.
Telegraph.
So that is an astounding number for that time period.
Telegraph.
A telegraph? That's a lot of people to telegraph. But yeah, 2,000 people. And this is a marble monument that stands over the graves of the early pastors, and that's what the inscription here and on the back talks about. So at the dedication, one of the pastors that was given a talk said, this colony was a colony made up of God's people. And this week, I'm going to quote from that talk that he gave, the presentation that he gave in 1888. So, we are to commemorate the sufferings and patience and faith of a humble colony of God's people and their faithful and devoted pastors. For more than 100 years, their sacred dust has lain in the bosom of your country, and no stone commemorates their grandly faithful lives. God has put it into the hearts of their descendants and friends to raise this marble shaft to remind the succeeding generations that the good and the pious should be remembered. Here around this stone today, representatives of a great number of those who swore religious creeds, and they worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience, with none to molest them or make them afraid. And we know that our ancestors had to leave their homeland in order to have freedom of religion. They suffered banishment and to settle in a strange wild land separated from their mother country by 4,000 miles of vast waste waters. It is to such sacrifices that they made that you have the privileges you now enjoy. The lesson of their lives was a focus of the talk of the pastors. But we know enough of them to take heart the lessons that their faithful lives teach us. Let us try to be worthy sons of worthy sires. Let us imitate them in all that is good and pious and Christ-like. They left us a good name. Every one of us must stand on our own accord, on our own record, And then while we ought to thank God for our godly ancestors, let us emulate their example and never let the good name they left us lose any of its luster by our wants of effort and appreciation of its great value. And this monument stands in your midst as the record of the good and the great. And as long as it endures, it becomes more and more interesting as it records more and more the piety and the virtue of the Salzburgers, and is perpetuated in their posterity. And we are that posterity. Now, we're focusing on the ladies, and this, I think, is appropriate that March is National Women's Month. That wasn't planned that way. I wrote this some time ago, and it just lined up to be, we're doing this in March, and we have these fine ladies that we can appreciate. We appreciate their sacrifices. So what you're going to do, you've got the numbers that you're going to look for, and like I said, our 1, 2, and 3 are right over there. And we're not going to have to walk far to get to them. But each lady is going to present a short bio about the ladies' lives and some interesting points in history. And then we're going to talk about, we're going to focus on a homemaking task that each lady may have, had to do. Because The men of our colony, our community rather, worked very hard, and the ladies had to work hard as well because homemaking, housekeeping was a lot of work.
Okay.
This is the first Lydia Whiteman Dasher. She was born in February the 15th, 1797. She was one of 6 daughters of Jedediah Whiteman and Hannah Keeper.
A little louder, please.
At the age of 16, she married Martin Dasher on October the 11th, 1813. This Martin was the son of Benjamin Dasher and Elizabeth Wyckoff. Lydia was mother of 12 children, 8 daughters, 4 sons. Her children were Israel, born in 1814, Anne Elizabeth, born in 1816, Jane Caroline, born in 1818. Sarah was born in 1819. Louis was born in 1821. Hannah was born in 1822. Rebecca was born in 1824. Mary, born in 1827. Thomas, born in 1830. Salome Sophie, born in 1832. Bergman, born in 1834. Laura Lydia, born in 1838. Lydia cared for 2 of her grandchildren, Alexandra and Alice, after their mother, Lydia's daughter, Sarah Dasher Armstrong, died in November 1849, 2 months after Alice's birth. Lydia died on June the 14th, 1881, and was buried by her husband, right here, in November of 1849, 2 months after her death, 16 years before she did, her husband. 4 of her children are buried here in the cemetery. Events in world history. Lydia was born during the last month of George Washington's presidency. Also, in 1797, the first ship of the U.S. Navy was commissioned. John Adams was sworn in as the 2nd president of the USA. British Admiral Horatio Nelson lost his arm in battle. The French Revolution was ongoing. James Garfield, the 20th president, was in office when Lydia died in 1881. Most of us have closets full of clothes, dresser drawers stuffed to the brim. We have a wardrobe for every season. We have special outfits to wear for certain occasions. If we want new clothes, we can go out to any number of stores to choose something we like. None of these statements were true for our ancestors. Ready-made clothes were not the norm. Ladies were tasked with the important job of sewing clothes for their families. Fabric known as yarn goods were hard to come by. Pins, needles, threads, sewing notions were valuable. Paper patterns were used repeatedly and carefully refolded after each use. Great care was taken to place the pattern pieces so close together as possible because there could be no wasted fabric. Scissors, often pinking shears, were used to cut garments pieces for the whole cloth. The shears cut the zigzag pattern that prevented fabric from fraying. A garment had to be sewn by hand, a task that could often take weeks to complete because of all the other housework that had to be done. Some garments made from this period are cotton or wool trousers, shirts made from shirting fabric, wool coats, sometimes lined, sometimes not, dresses usually made of cotton, pantaloons and crinolines used as slips under ladies' clothing, cotton or wool shirts, skirts, vests, bonnets made from cotton or straw. Year-round fabric were linen or cotton. Winter brought on woolsters and wool. Fancy vests could be made from silk or even cashmere and were used for Sundays. Cotton or linen vests, aprons, and sleeve extenders were common outer garments because they could be washed easy and the cotton fabric would last longer. Clothes were worn until they couldn't be worn anymore. There was no such thing as getting rid of something because it was no longer in style. Babies and toddlers, boys and girls wore gowns. Holes in clothes were patched. Lengths were extended so growing children could wear their clothes longer. Do you have older siblings? If so, your clothes could have been hand-me-downs. I grew up where I was the oldest, and I got hand-me-downs from my cousin, who was 2 years older than me. I gave my hand-me-downs to my sister, who was 2 years younger. Don't know what happened to hers, but I'm sure somebody made use of them.
Right, this lady was the sister of my great-grandfather. Her name is Jane Eliza Stanton. She was born March the 29th, 1827. She was the youngest child of Jacob Canaan and Christina Ron. At age 23, Jane married Patrick Henry Stanton on April 22nd, 1850. Patrick was a son of Patrick Stanton and Naomi Google. Jane was the mother of 7 children, but only 2 of her children lived to adulthood. Her children were Naomi, born in 1851, Charles, born in 1853, Mary Ella, born in 1855, but died a few months before her 5th birthday, Walter, born in 1857 and died at 19 months old, Harry, born in 1860, but drowned in Savannah at 16 and a half years of age. George, born in 1862 and died before age 6. A newborn was born and died in 1865. In 1851, Jane had her first child, Naomi. While living near the home of her mother-in-law, Naomi Google Whiteman. The home once stood halfway between the church and this cemetery. By the time Jane's second child, her son Charles, were born in 1853, the family had moved around the corner to Stanton property on modern-day Wiley Road. Therefore, Naomi Stanton is known as the last child born in the town of Ebenezer. Charles Stanton told this story to his family. In 1865, when Sherman was marching through Georgia, the Stanton women and children were just sitting down to eat breakfast when the Yankees arrived. The soldiers came into the home and ate the family's meal. Jane Eliza Stanton, Canaan Stanton, died on December the 1st, 1865, at age 38. Her husband, Patrick Stanton, died in July 1867. The Stanton children, Naomi, Charles, Harry, and George, went to live with their grandmother, Naomi Google Whiteman. Events in the world history. Jane was born when John Quincy Adams was president of the USA. Also in 1827, German composer Beethoven died in Vienna, Austria. The first transatlantic crossing by steam was made. Andrew Johnson, the 17th president, was in office when Jane died in 1865. Homemaking. Write out a grocery list, drive to the store, fill a cart with groceries. Those are tasks we do every day. Where did the food that fills your pantry come from? A box, a pan, a jar, a carton, a factory, a processing plant. Decades ago, the food our ancestors ate came right out of their own gardens, but putting food on the table took time and effort. Most of the men in our county were farmers, so most of the women were farmers' wives. Clearing land for fields was a monumental job that men often teamed up to complete. The cleared field was used for the bulk of the planting, but usually a kitchen garden was planted near the house. A kitchen garden is a small plot big enough to grow food, used to meet the needs of the day. It was located right outside the house and often had a picket or flat fence around it. Ladies could till the ground themselves if needed. Tilling was done with a single harrow push plow. The handles were wooden and a small rake behind the harrow helped remove grass or weeds while plowing. A hoe or spade could be used to till the dirt if a push plow was not available. Do any of you remember doing this in your childhood?
Yes.
Do it now.
Once the ground was ready, dead fish were planted in the soil to add fertilizer. Fish, water, or worm dirt could also be used to fertilize the garden. Seeds were placed in neat rows. The seeds had been carefully saved from the previous harvest or came from trading seeds with a neighbor. A lady could plant a variety of vegetables in her kitchen garden. Some plants were beets, cabbages, onions, peppers, squashes, turnips, greens, parsnips, radishes, beans, and peas. Strong-smelling vegetables like onions or greens were planted at the far end of the kitchen garden. This kept the smells from blowing into the house. Herbs were an important addition to a lady's garden and were planted closest to the house. Common herbs were thyme, sage, ginger, rosemary, spearmint, rue, balm, wormwood, lavender, marjoram, and chamomile. The herbs had a number of uses: seasonal, season the meal, provide fragrance near the house, medicinal purposes. The lady of a house could step out of the back door, gather the food to cook for the day in a bowl or basket, wash the food, and then cook for her family. This sounds easy once the garden is green and growing, but it takes a lot of work to get to that point. Now these pictures. Pictured here are two Stanton children who lived to adulthood. Naomi Stanton Wiley and Charles Everett Stanton. The home in the bottom photograph is of the Stanton home on Wiley Road. The picture was taken in 1919.
This is a picture of Naomi Google Stanton Whiteman, and it's a picture of an original painting, and it hangs in her great-great-great-grandson's house, Keith Stanton. Naomi Google Stanton Whiteman was born on October 27, 1795. She was one of 10 daughters of John Christopher Google Jr. and Mary Shuptrine. I have trouble with that one. At age 21, Naomi married Patrick Stanton on February 13, 1817. Patrick was an immigrant from Ireland and a store owner in Savannah. He died at the age of 32 on July 16, 1820, at the beginning of the yellow fever epidemic. Naomi had 2 sons during her short marriage to Patrick. John Harvey was born and died in 1818, and Patrick Henry was born in September 1820, 2 months after his father's death. At age 34, Naomi married Matthew Whiteman on November 19, 1829. Matthew died from pneumonia in 1837 at the age of 43. She did not have good luck with husbands living. Naomi inherited Matthew's Ebenezer town lots and the home now known as the old Salzburger house, which is over at Ebenezer, or the Fail house. The home originally stood halfway between the church and this cemetery. So you can kind of think it was probably where New Ebenezer is now. Naomi had 1 son during her marriage to Matthew Whiteman. John Lewis was born in 1831 and died in 1859. He's buried here beside his mother and half-brother Patrick Stanton. Naomi's 2 husbands, Patrick Stanton Sr. and Matthew Whiteman, and her infant son Harvey,
are all buried in Colonial Park Cemetery in Savannah, and they share one large tombstone. Now you're going to hear names that have to do with number 2 also, and Naomi. After the death, oh wait just a second. After the death of her daughter-in-law, Jane Ganan Stanton, in 1865, and her son Patrick Stanton in 1867, Naomi raised her grandchildren, Naomi, Charles, Harry, and George. You heard those names just recently? Naomi died on January 25th, 1879, and her home at Ebenezer was sold to Marion Waldauer and was rolled on logs up the road to the site off of Waldauer Road. The events in history during Naomi's lifetime was George Washington's second term of President of the United States. During that year, the French Revolution was ongoing. Louis XVII of France died, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th president, was in office at her death in 1879. Homemaking. To me, this is one of the most interesting parts, the homemaking stuff, because I never really think about it. And that's what I really enjoyed when we were practicing. Mine is baking bread, and that's something I do on a regular basis, so I really enjoyed it. Bread has long been a dietary staple. Bagged bread on a store shelf is a modern day convenience. However, decades ago, preparing the bread for the day's meal took a lot of work. Some type of grain was needed. Wheat, corn, rice, oats, barley, rye are common grains that are used for bread. After the grain was harvested and ready to use, it had to be ground into flour. Now, I don't have to grind my own flour. I just go buy it off the shelf. Some grains like wheat will become rancid if not used quickly. So just enough grain for the day's bread was put through a hand-cranked grinder and ground into the grain, and then you had to sift it. And how did that bread rise? How does our bread rise today when we bake it at home? Yeast. The yeast that we get out the little jar or the packet, right? Not so. Commercial yeast weren't produced until 1868, and baking powder was in 1869. Homemade yeast, called starters or wild yeast, had to be used to make sure you weren't baking hardtack for every meal. Homemade yeast can be made with potatoes, water, sugar. Hops can be added. This yeast takes about 3 days to become active, so you had to plan ahead. Boiled rice, sugar, water can be used. This also takes about 3 days to activate. If sugar's not available, some type of sweetener like honey or molasses has to be used because you have to feed those yeast. Salt and water can be used to make a dough rise, but the salt water mixture has to be kept quite warm or it won't work. Once your homemade yeast is active, you have to add sugar and warm water and cover it to let it rise. Then you have to add the sifted flour and the salt, and you can't overmix it though, although it is hard to overmix a dough by hand. Cover the mixture again so it will hopefully double in size. This process takes a few hours if the weather cooperates. The last few days have been great for bread making. Once the dough is risen, you can form rolls or loaves, and the bread was often baked in the bottom of an outdoor clay oven. If you've been here before for Labor Day, you may have seen bread being baked in an outdoor oven. Naomi's son Patrick Stanton owned an oven at a house. The Stanton's clay oven was located through the woods, kind of over in that area, and bread loaves that cook slowly, they take over an hour to bake. So much work went into preparing a single loaf of bread. It's easy to take such a staple for granted considering how easy bread is today.
Okay, my name is Diane Holder, I'm going to be talking to you and telling you some things about my great grandmother. Her name was Salome Helmy. She was born in 1791. Her parents were Jonathan Sechinger and Mary Frederica Scherhaus. Her mother was a Scherhaus. Her nickname was Sally. On her tombstone, it's hard to see, but it says Sally. It doesn't say Salome. So evidently, from a small child, that was her name, was Sally. She was 20 years old when she married Joshua Helmy on April the 23rd, 1811. He was the son of Nicholas and Maria Magdalena Helmy. I have to look at that to say it because it's kind of a twister. He was a farmer, so I don't think you have to tell you ladies what kind of life she had. She was a farmer's wife. So if any of you have been farmers' wives or lived on a farm growing up, you know she had a lot of tasks to do. And on top of that, she had 6 children. Her oldest child was John Frederick. Her second child was Mary Elizabeth, Israel Nicholas, Joshua Jr., Thomas Ephraim, and Shadrach Edward. 3 of her 5 sons married a woman by the name of Mary Ann. So she had 3 daughter-in-laws named Mary Ann. So if one of them got in trouble, and she didn't, like it said, they probably didn't know which one she was talking about. Sally died November the 11th, 1873. She was 69 years old. Thinking back, she lived a long time, considering the life that she had, because, you know, they didn't live as long as we do. So 69, she lived a pretty long time. Joshua lived 15 more years after her. When Sally was born during Washington's first term in office as president. Also in 1791, Washington, D.C. was declared the capital of the USA. When she died, James Buchanan was the 15th president. Opera composer Mozart died in Vienna that same year. Now, this is a picture of Shadrach, her youngest son, and his family. This is the only picture we could find of any of the Sechingers. And I have just known about her recently. I never knew. My mother told me years ago, my mother was a Helmy, so that's where part of my lineage comes from. And she said, oh, by the way, we're related to the Sechingers. And the gentleman that I knew named was Sechinger had just died. So I couldn't ask him about any of the family, so I've had to find out through other ways. Also in homemaking. Now, I think probably all of you are familiar with this, how to make lye soap. How many people have ever made lye soap? Okay, all right, we got some experts here. So they might have to help me because I don't know much about it. They would take a tub and they would put ashes in the tub. Then they would run water over the ashes. That was to make the potash that went in to make the soap. After that was done, then they put in what? Y'all know what they put in next to make the soap?
Grease.
Grease, that's right. The fat of the animal, usually a pig. And this would boil for hours on end. And then when they thought it was at the right consistency, I would guess, I didn't say this in the write-up, but I would guess they poured it out into flatter pans. So what did they do the next morning when it had hardened? Cut it into bars of soap. So guess what I did? If I can get it out, I didn't have a pocket. That is lye soap. I've had this piece of soap for years. My husband and I were in Dahlonega years ago, and I bought some lye soap. And we had a grandson who was living with us, and so when he didn't tell the truth, I'd tell him, I'm going to wash your mouth out with what? Lye soap. That's the truth. This also is a new one on me, is to how to clean your laundry with potatoes. Who's ever heard of that? Oh, this is a new one on me too. Okay, you take your Irish potatoes and you clean them very good. Of course, you'd have to take all the peeling, and then you boil them down to a mush that's kind of like an oatmeal type mush. Then you put your clothes in them and you boil them. It's supposed to take out any stains or grease or anything like that that would get in the clothes. Then you let that cool off, and then you, just like you would if you're washing your clothes with a lye soap, you would rinse them very well and get all the potatoes off of them too. And then you would either hang it over tree limbs, which I imagine if they had tree limbs they were using, they would keep them so they didn't have so many little sprouts on them, or moss either. Or they tie a line, say between trees or a house and a tree or whatever. Now, this had to be done early in the morning. Why? They could dry, because how well can you wring out a pair of heavy men's pants? Not very well. So if they took them in before they would dry, what would happen the next day or so? Mildew, and that's sure not nice, and it could ruin the clothes. So I am so thankful that right before I got old enough, we had a wringer machine on the back porch. Praise God, my mother bought an automatic machine about the time she thought I could wash clothes. That's the truth. I'd never been so happy in all my life, because I saw that thing and I knew good and well, even though I was about 10 or 12 years old, that thing was going to be hard to work. So I'm very thankful for the washing machine. And even at home now, I am very thankful for that washing machine. And I'm so glad I've got to know about this grandmother. And I know one day I will see her when I go to heaven.
I am standing here by the grave of my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Christina Ron. She was born February 22nd, 1787, and was a daughter of Jonathan Ron and Christina Bunce. Now, at age 20, Christina married John Adam Metzger in November of 1807. Now, he wrote his will just a few short months later. 4 months later, April 28, 1808, his will is recorded in the very same record book that their marriage license was just, or their marriage document was just recorded. We know he died by May 16, 1808, because his will was probated. In his will, he referred to having been confined to his bed. So they were married for a very short time. Now, at age 25, Christina married Jacob Gannan, that's buried here. He was born in, she married him December 11, 1812. He was born 1791 and was the son of the Jacob Gannan that was born in 1766 and his wife Catherine Schneider. Now, Christina was the mother of 8 children. William, who was born in 1813 and he died 33 days later, he's buried right there. Evelyn, who was born in 1815. Frederick, born in 1817. Cletus, born in 1819. Elbert, born in 1821. George Bergman Gannan, my ancestor, Claiborne, the baby, born in 1823, died 3 months later. And George Bergman Gannan, my ancestor, pictured here with his family, born in 1824. And Jane Eliza, who just heard about over there, was born in 1827. Now, this Gannan family owned land up modern-day Stillwell Road and also land just south of Turkey Branch. Now, there are roads named for Christina's descendants in those areas. We've got Cletus, Frederick, and Eugene Gannan roads named after her descendants. Now, Christina died November 23rd, 1844, and Jacob had died 4 years before that, and 5 of their children, 2 of the babies, there's a son here, 5 children are buried here in this cemetery with them. Now, Christina was born in 1787, which was 2 years before George Washington even became president of the United States. So in the year she was born, from May to September in Philadelphia, we've got the Constitutional Convention going on. In September 17th, the year she was born, the United States Constitution was signed. So that gives you a perspective of her lifetime. John Tyler, who was the 10th president, was in office when she died in 1844. Now, the homemaking skill that I'm going to talk about is, what do you do with all the beef and dairy that the cows produce? Now, a lot of the men in our county were farmers, they had cows, and it was up to the men to clear the fields and provide the fodder and build the shelters for the cows, and the ladies focused on drying and cooking the beef, and then using all of the dairy products for many of the things that they had to make them, including soap. Now, cows were talked about in 1740 by Pastor Boltzius. He said, cattle raising is very advantageous, but the beginning is most difficult. So much work went into raising cows. Now, the cows provided the milk for their youngs, and so the farmers had to come up with a way of having gestation and deliveries throughout the year, because cows lactate after they've had babies. So if all the cows have babies at once, we're going to have weaning all at once, and there's not going to be milk throughout the year. So circulating those births, that was very important, and they came up with ways to do that. It's something that I have friends that raise goats. They even have to do that now to be able to have milk throughout the year. Now, milk has a variety of uses. Of course, it's a very common beverage. It always has been. I've heard that there is nothing quite like a warm, fresh glass of milk straight from the cow. Never had it, but I've heard, lots of praises about such a thing. Now, after milking, the bucket was set aside, and the cream, which is the milk with the highest fat content, comes up to the top and is scooped out for many uses. Now, to be able to keep that bucket of milk cold, that bucket could be put down the well where it's cooler throughout the day. Now, butter is another popular product that's made from milk. A great deal of physical labor is involved in churning butter. You've got to get the fat separated, and that's going to be either with a butter churn where the paddle has to go up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down for hours and hours and hours, or a barrel with the handle crank on the side. It's got to be done for hours. If a family didn't have a butter churn, they could use a jar. You could use a jar if you had no butter churn. So butter churns were made of wood, eventually made of metal, and then pottery too. And the buttermilk was left over after churning butter, and that was used as a drink and in baking, so nothing was wasted. Now, cheese comes whenever milk ferments, and the cheese curds, those curds, that's what becomes cheese after the milk curdles. Now, baskets were used first to be able to separate the cheese curds from the liquid. The liquid had to be forced out, allowed to drain out in some way, and the baskets allowed for that separation. Eventually, cheese would be made in wooden molds or even pottery. Now, whey is the liquid that comes whenever the milk separates from the cheese, and that was used as a drink and in baking and in making more butter and cheese. After the cows were slaughtered, the meat is going to be dried or smoked or cooked. So the fresh meat, that gets cooked, but a lot of the meat was cut and dried. So you have to the ladies would cut the meat into strips, lay it in a pan. It's got to dry in the hot sun like what I'm standing in now, and it's going to be drying for some time. A common place to dry meat was setting it on the roof right there in the beaten down sun. That way animals wouldn't get it too. Now, it had to be set in the hot sun so that it wouldn't spoil, because that's just gross to even think about. Another option of being able to dry meat was cut a slice and put twine through the holes in the meat that you've cut, hang it up to dry. It's going to be left out in the day and taken in at night. Now, drying meat would take several days. Now, after the fresh meat was cooked, that fat that comes up was going to be used for a multitude of things. Miss Diane just mentioned the lye soap that fat from animals used to make. So we're going to be baking with it, frying with it, even making a salve. Some people even made candles with that fat from the animal. Now, all the dairy products, the beef products that we know and love today, they're so easy to purchase, but years and years ago, they took a lot of work for our ancestors to create. And then here, Christina Ron, this is her son right there with the really cool beard, like that. And his name's George Bergman Ganan. He's my ancestor. He's buried at Bethel. And this is his family and his niece right there, but his wife and kids are around.
My name is Barbara Ron Scott. Scott is certainly not Salzburger,
but Ron is. The person that I'm speaking on today is Charlotte Ron Reeser. Charlotte Ron Reeser was born November the 14th of 1821. She was the daughter of Emmanuel Ron and Sarah Berry. Charlotte's father died in September of 1822, less than a year after her birth. So it's sad to say, but Charlotte never remembered her father. My husband's father died when he was 2, and he has no memory of his father. So I'm sure a 1-year-old has no memory of theirs, which is sad. At age 16, Charlotte married Christopher Frederick Reeser on February the 12th of 1838. Christopher was the son of David Reeser and Mary Grovenstein. Charlotte was the mother of 17 children. Any of you have 17 children? I hope not. 13 daughters and 4 sons. She had 9 daughters before she had a son. This is the order of her children. Hannah in 1839, Sarah, born in 1840, Frances, 1841, Susan in 42, Margaret in 44, Josephine in 45, Mary in 46, Jane in 48, Anna in 50, that's 1850. Finally, Virgil was born in 1851. Don't you know that Daddy was excited? Finally a boy after 9 girls. Addie was born in 1853, John Walter in 1855, Matilda in 57, William in 60, Bartow in 61, Alice in 63, and Ella in 1865.
Barbara, they all lived to maturity too.
Yeah, they did.
That's his great. When was the first child born?
1839
To 65.
to 65. When Charlotte and Christopher celebrated their 40th birthday in 1878, all 17 of their children were still living and were at the celebration. Anniversary, excuse me. Which was remarkable for that time period. So many children died early in life, but all their children lived. Charlotte died May the 9th of 1899. Her husband Christopher died 15 years before she did. You would think raising all those children, she would have been the first to go. But it didn't happen that way.
Maybe they shared the labor.
In that day and time, I kind of doubt it, don't you? 9 of their 17 children are buried here in this cemetery. Events in the world that were going on in the day that Charlotte lived. Charlotte was born when James Monroe was President of the United States. In 1821, when she was born, Napoleon Bonaparte died. George IV was crowned King of the United Kingdom. The U.S. gained possession of Florida. William McKinley, the 25th president, was in office the year Charlotte died. Now, I'm a registered nurse, have been since I was 23, 24. So the homemaking part that Erica wrote for me is very interesting because it's about the health care of the family. Most of our ancestors had a house full of children. I think we've heard 9, we've heard 12, 17. You know, families were large in that day and time. So we had to keep those families well. We had to keep them from being sick, and when they were sick, we had to get them well. There was no modern medicine. There was no doctor to call, or if he was miles and miles away, and it took forever for him to get there by horseback or wagon. No immediate med for us to go to. The ladies relied on many home remedies. Some new, some passed down from their mothers and their grandmothers to help their large broods get well when they were sick. Some common ailments and the remedies used were, for a headache, we get out our bottle of ibuprofen or Tylenol or Advil, but they got out their ice pack or their damp cloth and applied it to the head. For fever, they used ice or a cold bath, which was used to bring the fever down. For an earache, they dripped onion juice in the ear. Don't you know that smelled delightful? For stomach aches, chamomile was the mildest remedy given to cure a stomach ache, so I would hope this was what they used with the children. But then there was that castor oil. Do y'all remember castor oil?
Yes.
Castor oil on Saturday night, and what happened on Sunday morning? I remember castor oil. Usage of this harsh laxative dates back centuries before Christ's birth. Bug bites. Honey covered with an apple peel was one remedy for bug bites. Honey has antibacterial properties that may help prevent infections. Remember that today. It's a good thing to know. Cuts. Honey was also used to cover cuts because of its antibacterial properties. A paste with brown sugar was also used to cover cuts. Burns. How many of you have an aloe plant? Do you use it for burns? Okay. That's a remedy that has gone on down through the generations. Most women will have an aloe plant somewhere around their house. And if you burn your arm on the oven, you break off a piece of the aloe plant and rub it on your arm. And it really works, doesn't it?
It works for pink eye too.
Does it? Never tried it for pink eye. Was that a remedy that you learned from your parents or grandparents? On the internet?
They want you to take an antibiotic or whatever that messes you up, and like 3 days it's gone.
Really? Well, if we trust the internet, we can try it for pink eye, but that wasn't a remedy passed down by mother or grandmother.
Right.
Okay, heartburn, artichoke. I don't think artichokes are raised around here much anymore, but artichoke was cooked or used as a tea and given for heartburn sufferers. Nausea, spearmint was one remedy for nausea, and ginger was another. And I think commonly now we still know that ginger ale, if it has real ginger in it, will soothe our nausea. Okay. Colic. This is one that really gets me. A baby might have colic, and if they did, a common remedy was to close the baby up in the room with someone smoking nearby the colicky baby. I hope no one uses that one anymore. Overheating. With so many farms in our community, which at that time, there's not a lot of farms in Effingham County now, but there were in that day and time, people would overheat while working in the fields, and a cold bath was a remedy for someone overcome with the hot Georgia sun. Hypothermia. When freezing temperatures hit, hypothermia was a concern. Someone suffering from the cold would take a hot bath. So it was just the opposite for overexposure to the sun or overexposure to the cold. Food poisoning. Strong coffee was given to the victim because coffee speeds up the digestion. Iron deficiency. How many of you have an iron skillet? I still have one too, and I use mine regularly. We'll see if this sounds familiar. Rusty nails were placed in a bucket of water and allowed to sit for a while. The water was dipped out and given as a drink, often to children. We acquire that same iron when we use iron frying pans. Muscle pain. A turpentine mixture was rubbed on the skin. And I've never rubbed turpentine on me, But I watched my grandfather, who lived to be 96 years old. It was always amusing to me to watch him get in bed. He had this procedure. Vicks salve went up his nose,
Right.
and turpentine went on the calves of his legs and his feet. And he swore by that. He thought that really kept his feet and legs from hurting. And many people used it in his time and before his time for that purpose, for muscle pain. Snake bite. Herbal remedies were given to the victims to drink, and tobacco was commonly applied to the bite area. And I think it was that drawing effect of the tobacco, and I think we use it today even for wasp bites. Somebody will say, chew some tobacco, and we'll chew it and put it on the wasp bite. We are blessed to live in a time when medical advancements allow for proper diagnosis, treatment, and cures for the ailments that we have. Our ancestors were not so fortunate, but they blazed the way for us. Our ancestors are precious. They have brought down to us precious memories, precious ideas, and it has been a pleasure to honor this woman in our cemetery today, Charlotte Ron Reeser.